Hey everybody, welcome to the third and final teaching video of this quarter. Today we're going to be talking about conclusions. I thought it would be an apt way to end our time together because unfortunately I won't be the writing intern continuing on with those of you who choose to take the third quarter of this sequence. Unfortunately, that's just how it shakes out because the third quarters are optional, so there are far fewer sections. If I could stay, I would because I quite enjoy working with you. But let's go on to our video. All right, so I've previously talked about conclusions as something a lot more nebulous than introductions, something that we can't really focus a lesson plan around in the same structured fashion because there isn't such a pattern as the destabilization consequences pattern that goes into crafting a good introduction. But just because there's no real rule about how to structure it doesn't mean there aren't some helpful tips that we can cover. All right, what do you want from a conclusion? Well, we've talked about the importance of recapping your argument, but that is much more complicated than just presenting your subclaims and main thesis in a sentence or two. If you only did that in your conclusion, it would be really short and kind of, an anticlimax. So it's pretty good if you can try and flesh out your conclusion a bit more, get into some of the details of how your subclaims build to your main claim. You can give a more involved roadmap of the argument you've presented now that it's complete. Not only can you tell the reader, and as I've said, before, here are my claims, my subclaims, and how they build up to my main claim, but you can also really specifically mention how those different subclaims work together, because that might not come through even if you write really good body paragraphs. Your reader might still be struggling to see how all the pieces fit together. And that's, the conclusion gives you an opportunity to clarify. Stakes are also very important. We've talked about stakes. And the most nebulous of all is a sense of finality, which is to say, you want the reader to step away from the conclusion thinking, yes, that paper existed and then it came to a natural conclusion. And I left it feeling like I had learned something, not feeling like it came to a really abrupt end. Speaking of which, that was odd. Bear with me. Here's what you don't want from a conclusion: too sudden or abrupt an ending. We want to hear your final thoughts. This is your chance to really leave the reader with a take-home message. We also don't want more than one conclusion. I've seen this a couple of times. Sometimes people feel the need to write a short paragraph in between longer body paragraphs, or even right before the conclusion, summarizing the previous steps in the argument. Don't do that. It's unnecessary because your paragraph should explain your ideas in a way that makes them clear. So you shouldn't need to take that extra step of clarifying after the fact. And it makes the conclusion itself feel redundant because you've already done a lot of that wrap-up work. But because it's in the middle of the paper, it breaks up the flow of the argument. It can actually make it harder for the reader to track how your claim develops from one paragraph to the next. Finally, we don't want just a summary of your argument. We want to understand where you're coming from, the stakes of that, why it matters, and we don't want something too short because it feels unsatisfactory if you've got these beautiful page-long body paragraphs that are really rich with analysis and textual evidence, and then you get to the end of the paper and it's a 2-sentence wrap-up. It's going to feel rushed. Nor my phone falling off the table. So yeah, beefy conclusions, stronger than really, really short, abrupt ones. Here's an example. Take a minute to pause and read it and then come back. Welcome back. So this is from caveat, this is all my writing today. I'm much more comfortable talking about the flaws in my own writing than talking about the flaws in someone else's writing, especially in a public setting. So that's why I'm roasting my own papers again. So this was a paper I wrote for this quarter of this class, and we were doing a comparative project, and I thought it was sufficient at the time to introduce my claim, or to conclude by talking about my claim, how it pertained to "And the Earth Did Not Devour Him," how it pertained to this painted scroll that we looked at in the Special Collections Library, and note that both objects had a theme of the one constant being change. that's all well and good, but I'm not really delving into why that matters, how it's important that these two very different objects from disparate times, cultures, places have this shared feature. I'm not really talking about what that means. So I'm not really, the stakes of this argument aren't really clear, nor are the specifics of the argument. It's kind of just a vague final sentence or two. I think this is two sentences that are just really long. So this is not great. Too short, no stakes. Here is another example. Side note, you should all take this class if you're at all interested in Balkan folklore or folklore more broadly. It's in the Russian and Eastern European Studies Department, taught by Angelina Ilieva. Balkan folklore, one of the best undergrad classes available. Take a minute to pause, think about this intro, and then come back, or this conclusion, and then come back. All right, welcome back. So in this paper, it's also a comparative essay, but I was comparing two things that sort of make more sense together intuitively because they come from related Balkan cultures. That's a loaded statement, but there is a lot of shared cultural motifs across the different Balkan cultures. And so it doesn't come across quite as jarring that I'm talking about these two things that are fairly different as it did in the previous example. Additionally, I make more of an effort to talk about how these two things are similar and what it means that they're similar by talking about how both these murdered wives and this shepherd are doing this symbolic completion of their lives and in these folk stories by transmuting their deaths into something broader and more meaningful. But it's still very short, and I'm still not pushing far enough with the stakes. Here I end this conclusion by saying that these figures gain symbolic power, paralyzing the social power for which they are killed. That's actually a fairly strong claim, but I could talk a lot more about why that matters and how that shapes one's approach to reading these folk stories. And I don't do that. And so it's not satisfactory. It could go farther, both in terms of length and in terms of stakes, even if it feels like there's a little less missing. Gotta move myself out of the way. All right, let's take a look at this third example, trigger warning. This paper was my undergrad thesis. It talks a lot about death, and I deal with these German poems about autopsies, and one is about racialized autopsies. And there is a word that I will not say, but that is written on the screen. And it's not quite the N-word, but it's similar, but German, and I'm not gonna say it. It's in this paper. It's the title of the poem I was writing about. Trigger warning. All right, take a minute to read this. Okay, welcome back. So this is, I think, both a better example of a conclusion and also an example of a difficult gray area line to toe in writing conclusions. So let's get to it. The majority of this, it's much longer, and that is good because it feels less, like a rushed, tacked on ending, that because a lot of conclusions when you write a really short one, it sort of feels like you just put one in there because it's necessary, not because you actually felt like it needed a conclusion to wrap up the paper. But papers feel much more, complete and consistent and whole when they've got this like neat little ending to them that actually tracks and fits with the paper. So I think this is a good example of doing that because I talk about the various themes I bring up in the larger paper, but I do so in a way that links each one to the main argument. So the argumentative flow and my reasoning for including each body paragraph are sort of justified by this final statement of, and see, here is how all of the pieces come together. The contemporary reader's expectations, the proximity to death leading to a better understanding of life, making death less alien by discussing how it, exists in the bodies of people who are living now and will be dead, or who are dead but were living. So I think this is a good example of that kind of, weaving together of the themes of your paper in a way that feels like you're wrapping up all of those pieces. Like it's like when you're it's like when you're tying ribbons around a present and you've got to gather up all the pieces of the ribbon to make the bow. Um, if you're making one of those big fancy bows, I don't know, you can probably just buy those at the store. But if you're making one of those ones and you like have to tie all the pieces together and curl them with scissors, like maybe you don't know what I'm talking about. I just had my 4th COVID vaccine, so I'm a little out of it. But it's like that. You're gathering a bunch of things together and tying them up into a neat little bow so that the reader really sees why you made the choices you made in this argument. So that's what I think this does right. Another thing I think it does right is provide an ending with a sense of finality, which is to say that this ending line, although the movement has already both occurred and ceased, it is no less real because it is over, sort of succinctly puts a period. It like succinctly puts a period on the whole feeling of this conclusion, which is building up to this idea that even though people die, that doesn't mean they never lived, which is the ethos behind a lot of these poems that I was writing about. So finding a way to sort of sum up your ideas about something in like a succinct, meaningful phrase that also sort of steps back a little bit and takes the stakes out of like how one interprets the language of the poems to a sort of idea. Or now this is a much broader idea than you would actually be working with on a paper for this class, because this was 14 pages long and the end of a 4-year project. I was in the fundamentals major, so my entire undergraduate career was spent reading poetry and novels about death and working up to this paper. So it's a kind of a different beast. Like you wouldn't make a claim quite this broad with stakes quite this broad in a 5-page paper. You wouldn't have the time. You wouldn't have the space either. But I think it nevertheless provides a good model. That being said, I do something here at the top, which is a little iffy. And I'm not sure I would do that if I were writing this today, which is including quotes. So quotes in the conclusion are generally a terrible idea. I'm not gonna mince my words. They're generally a terrible idea because they are evidence, and evidence is typically associated with argument, but you don't want to be making an argument in your conclusion. You want to be summing up your argument. So it's generally a bad idea to include quotes. Now, I included these 2 words because they were particularly key to my claim, which was that the language of these poems plays with the idea of life and death being in a sort of flux and existing within each other. And so I wanted to talk about the ways in which those 2 things are represented as, dead being warm. So that's kind of what I was going for here, using these 2 individual words as a representation or as part of the representation of my claim. And that is a lot less risky than just throwing out like a whole clause of a sentence or a whole sentence of evidence in the conclusion, but it's still a risk. The biggest concern when you're dealing with evidence, though, is if instead of using it to represent your argument, you're using it to actually present an argument. Sometimes people find great evidence late in the process of drafting a paper and don't have space to put it in a body paragraph. And they think, oh, well, I have to acknowledge it, so I should put it in the conclusion. No, do not. If you put it in the conclusion, it'll make it sound like a great addition to your argument, but it won't sound like a conclusion. It'll sound like a body paragraph. And the reader will go, okay, I see 5 great body paragraphs and no conclusion instead of 4 great body paragraphs and a conclusion. It's better to have a conclusion than to turn your conclusion into a body paragraph. So yeah, don't make new arguments in your conclusion. That's the real issue. Including evidence is often how that ends up being presented. Like, you can't really make a new argument without including evidence. So most of the time when someone's making a new argument in their conclusion, that will manifest as evidence being in the conclusion. But it's kind of more than that. You don't want to be making claims that are beyond the scope of your paper. Well, okay, but what about stakes? Aren't stakes a new argument? Not quite, because though they're primarily addressed in the conclusion, the stakes have been present with you from the beginning. You should introduce them in your introduction, and they should sort of at the very least inform, if not directly sort of pop up at the ends of some of your body paragraphs. So it's not really an element that is all new in the conclusion. And it's also not really a separate argument. The stakes are more like the consequences of the argument you've made, the reasons it's important. So it's not really like you're making a whole new claim. If you feel like adding evidence, don't. I wish I hadn't. It doesn't really add that much to that example I showed you. It just makes me feel like, oh no, younger Alex, what did you do? I skipped a slide, so let's talk about the issue of matching. Matching is important. You want your paper to feel like it matches throughout. You want it to have a consistent sense of self. And how this can manifest is having an intro and conclusion that actually match your paper. Sometimes you'll see a paper that's really great, really strong on the body, but the intro is 2 sentences long, the conclusion is 3 sentences long, and they talk about the claim in these really wooden, uncertain, vague terms that don't really match the nuance of the argument that you're actually making in the body paragraphs. And that's always a shame, because great body paragraphs deserve a great intro and a great conclusion. So don't err on the side of being short. And get into the complexity of your claim. If you think that your conclusion and introduction match your paper, that's great. But it's always a good idea to double check and to have somebody else double check, because sometimes we can have a better sense of what we're going for than what we've actually written. So it's great to have somebody else put their eyes on your paper and say, I think that you're talking about these things in a bit of a vague tone here. And in the body paragraphs, you feel like you have this really specific idea of what you're doing, but you're not actually acknowledging that in the intro or conclusion. That's also why it's great to write these last, because when you're done writing your body, you have a much clearer idea of what you actually argue than when you start out. And if you don't have, if your intro and conclusion are mismatched to your body paragraphs, it looks kind of silly, and it kind of undercuts the great merit of your great body paragraphs, because the intro is the first glimpse of your paper that the reader sees, and the conclusion is the last part you leave them with. So you want to make sure that they start with a good first impression and end on a positive note. Okay, promise we're almost done. I know this has been kind of a long video. I just wanted to say I'm really proud of you guys. You've come so far this year. Your papers are beautiful. You're becoming these great writers, and I'm really excited to read your next papers, and I'm really excited for whoever is your writing intern next quarter to get to read your papers next quarter. For those of you who continue in the sequence, I think you're well on your way to becoming great scholars, and it's been a pleasure being your writing intern, and I will miss you a lot, but I hope you don't miss me, because I hope you have an even better writing intern next time. And if not, I hope at least that you have somebody with a very different approach to teaching, so that you can get the benefit from, hearing totally different voices on commenting on your papers, because I think that's one of the great benefits of this program, is that if something I say doesn't quite resonate with you, perhaps the next writing intern you work with in the spring will be able to say things in a tone that makes more sense, or just phrase things a bit differently, because we're all talking about the same basic principles of writing an essay, but we have totally different ways of teaching, like one person to the next. I mean, so do your professors. And so I really hope that you have somebody great, and that you learn a lot from them. And if you decide not to take the third quarter of the sequence, I know that you'll go on to do great things regardless. And so hooray for you guys, and congratulations on finishing the first 2 quarters of your human sequence.